Welcome back. It's been 7 months since I last recorded an interview. Been on hiatus for a while, and the podcast has had a bit of a rebrand, changing name, changing direction. I'm not going to bore you with all that now. In fact, I'm going to bore you with those details in a little quick snippet episode that will come out before this one. And to be honest, I'm sort of chomping at the bit to get going, so let's just crack on, eh? So my guest today is Eric Schwitzgebel, who's been with us once before. Eric is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. His research explores connections between empirical psychology and philosophy of mind, especially the nature of belief, the inaccuracy of our judgments about our stream of conscious experience, which is what we spoke about last time, and the tenuous relationship between philosophical ethics and actual moral behaviour. He's the author of a number of books, including Perplexities of Consciousness, and most recently, A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures. Eric, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again. I enjoyed our last conversation.
Yeah, so, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. You know the score, and if people listen to the little episode before this, people should know the score. But for those that can't be asked or are too lazy to listen to that episode, basically, very quickly, this podcast used to be called My Own Worst Enemy. It was a mental health podcast. And I fell out of love with the mental health industry for various reasons. I've done a whole 2-hour episode on that. You can go back and listen to that. But the things that I enjoyed most about the podcast, I decided to double down on. So I enjoyed bringing philosophical discussions into what was predominantly a psychology and mental health podcast. And the other thing I enjoyed was having conversations that were uncomfortable conversations. So a couple of examples of them were discussing gay conversion therapy with a guy called David Pickup, antinatalism with David Benatar, and then the most uncomfortable conversation I had and the most controversial episode I ever did was a 3-hour conversation with a pro-contact paedophile called Tom O'Carroll. And there was something about those experiences that were obviously uncomfortable, but I enjoyed not so much the reaction from the audience, because reactions are, people get offended and abusive about the content you're putting out. But those conversations tend to spark the most interesting emails from people that had either made them think differently about topics or that wanted to debate me about my own opinions that I'd expressed during the episodes. And I thought, rather than just scrap the podcast altogether, I want to double down on that stuff. And so this new podcast is called the Renegade Ape Podcast. And the subtitle is Psychology, Philosophy, and the Overton Wasteland. I made that up. Don't anybody steal it. I Googled it to make sure. So Overton Wasteland, that's mine. If you see that anywhere else, I came up with that. So basically,
duly noted.
Yes. So basically what that's alluding to is discussing things that are outside of the Overton window. And again, if you've not listened to the episode before this one, you might be thinking, well, what the hell is the Overton window? Quite possibly you might have heard of it. It's come up a lot in especially political discussions over the past couple of years. But for those people that don't know what the Overton window is, I'm going to hand this over to you now, Eric, if you want to sort of give us a good jumping off point with a definition of the Overton window, what it is, where it came from, what it means.
Right. So this concept has recently become popular. I started thinking about it, and I went to trace down its academic roots, and it's slightly a strange story. So this is named after a scholar, Joseph P. Overton, who's not a particularly well-known scholar, hadn't published very much, died in a plane crash before publishing anything about what's now called the Overton window. He was a libertarian thinker who worked in a think tank, and basically someone who was influenced by him, who liked his work, kind of picked up on this idea that he had informally proposed and turned it into a kind of blog post or things available on the internet. And it never really got kind of scholarly footing before it became popular. So it's kind of an interesting history. It's not named after a particularly renowned scholar or something like that.
And what's the definition of the Overton window? Particularly
Right.
the original, because it's morphed since then. I'd say, but the original definition.
Right. The original definition has to do with policy proposals, right? So the idea is there's a certain range, a window of policy proposals that are kind of within the realm of normally acceptable discourse. So if I were to give a policy proposal of, say, cut off everyone's left hand, right? I'm like, wait, that's not in the realm of ordinary political discourse, right? That would be way outside of a window of ordinary discourse. Whereas if I were to say, something like, well, let's, increase tax rates by 5% on the wealthy, that would be the kind of thing you might agree with, you might disagree with. It might be relatively popular or unpopular, but it's certainly the kind of thing that we talk about all the time. Right, so things within the realm of the Overton window are policy proposals that are kind of considered legitimate debate topics. You don't have to be kind of far outside of the norm to be taken seriously. And then things outside of the Overton window are these things that, if you propose them, people would find that strange, or they think they're ridiculous, or they're just not on people's radars as reasonable things to be thinking about.
Yeah, so I'm just going to try and have a crack at this screen sharing nonsense here on Zoom. So I should bring up I don't know if we can see that now. Can you see that at your end there, Eric?
I do see it, yes.
Yeah, so there you go. So that's an example of it. That the Overton window is that little bit there in the middle, where something is actually it's policy. It's already been enacted, so it's considered the norm. And then on the other side of that, on either side of that, are popular opinions or popular ideas. I've got to say as well, Eric. What do you? I haven't obviously thought of this enough. What are the two? Because there's two different directions there, and it's popular, sensible, acceptable on either side. I'm assuming that is that referring to the left and right wing politics. I'm guessing.
I would think this is the left and right wing version of it, and the way that the viewers look at this, there's a little window around popular and policy in the middle, and then sensible and acceptable are outside of the window. And this, I would say, since there isn't really a solid kind of scholarly source or scholarly consensus around this, you could debate what it means. But the way I just defined Overton window and think about it myself would be a little bit bigger than this box, right? So it would include not only things that are policy and popular, but also things that people would regard as moderately sensible or kind of acceptable realm of discourse. And it wouldn't include things on the far left or far right political ends that people would think of as being radical or unthinkable. And I don't think that you necessarily have to think of things in terms of this left-right, blue-red spectrum, right? There can be things that would be outside of the Overton window without being politically aligned, like cutting off people's left hand would be an example.
Yeah, well,
right. So, yeah.
I think this is where this sort of broader definition comes in, where I'm sort of crowbarring it into the title of this podcast, where it's also come to mean not just like policy proposals, ideas that people are trying to sort of enact or enforce on other people, but just the realm of acceptable discourse. So things that are okay to talk about, and whether that be in either a private or a public manner. Would you agree with that definition as well?
Yes, I like that definition. And that is kind of how I think of it myself now. And I think that's, in a way, more helpful. Well, I don't know if it's more helpful, but it's closer to how I think of it, yes.
Yeah, so, well, that's it. You see, that's what the draw is for me, is the idea of, and like you've just said with the window there, I would agree that the frame or the parameters of the Overton window, for me at least, stretch out to sensible and acceptable. And it's only when we start getting to radical and unthinkable that it becomes interesting for me, I guess. And so I guess, as well as sort of defining the Overton window and talking about it in a philosophical context, part of this discussion for us today is to sort of help me decide the parameters of this podcast moving forward, because we'll probably get into this a bit later, but I would argue that when I just think about this very quickly off the top of my head, and when I was conceptualizing this new direction of the podcast, I don't think there's any conversation that I am not willing to have. I don't think there's anything off the table. I don't think there's any conversation that somebody could suggest to me where I would say that is an unacceptable subject. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to agree with the ideas that are set forward. Obviously, I've interviewed a pro-contact paedophile, for instance, and we found almost no agreement during that conversation. But I'm wondering whether I'd like to sort of test the boundaries of that idea, and whether we can maybe find anything today that's any difficulties with that idea, because I think maybe I've oversimplifying it to myself, or maybe not thinking about the consequences of it enough. And so I was thinking about, before we get into some sort of, because I know you've written a blog post on this about the philosophical concepts that we can sort of drill down into that are good examples. But before we do that, I was thinking of the sort of the different contexts or the different types of unacceptable discourse. So I've managed to think of three. And so the first one is offensive discourse. So a good example of that is any discussions around race and IQ. So quite famously, Sam Harris interviewed the author of The Bell Curve. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Do you know what it is?
Charles Murray.
Charles Murray, right? Of course. Yes, yeah. Charles Murray. And so they had a big, long discussion about that book. And Sam Harris came to the conclusion that for all the arguments around it and for all the scholarly work that underpins it, he doesn't see anything to be gained from having that conversation. That it's only going to be a troublesome conversation. Secondly, is things that are considered sort of ridiculous, and to some people, especially scientists, they find them offensive. So, like conspiracy theories. So right. Things like 9/11, the flat Earth theory, the idea that the moon's a spaceship, and things like that. Scientists in particular tend to get the backs up about those sorts of things. But I'd say they'd fall into the ridiculous category. And then I guess things that are pointless. And the only one I could think of off the top of my head was this old, I don't even know if this is an apocryphal example, but this idea that philosophers used to argue about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
I don't think they actually argued about that. I think that's a kind of parody of the kind of thing that they argued. I mean, maybe someone argued it, but...
Right,
yeah,
okay. Yeah. Those are the ones I could think of, sort of offensive, ridiculous, and pointless. And I was just wondering if there was any other categories that you could think of that would lie outside the Overton window in that sense.
Yeah, those are nice categories. I'm thinking whether there should be another category for things that has a more of a positive tinge. Okay. For things that aren't kind of on people's radar, but not necessarily for good reasons, like kind of unthought of.
Right.
Ideas that are so different that our conservative tendency is to think, oh, well, that's got to be wrong. But it's not because it's ridiculous or pointless or offensive.
Is anything springing to mind as an example for that?
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about is plant cognition.
Okay.
Which is one thing you might have initially a ridiculous kind of reaction to it, right? And there are ways in which it kind of becomes ridiculous. Perhaps, when you think about people, say, talking to their plants and thinking the plants understand their conversation and that kind of thing is probably, not much to that, right? So that would be plant cognition kind of on the ridiculous side. But on the non-ridiculous, but I don't know if we should accept it side, but outside the window, maybe starting to come within the window of discourse, is the idea that the kinds of unconscious cognitive processes that human beings do when we, say, get stuff hits our eyes and then we do some kind of cognition to turn it into perceived objects. Right? There's a lot of early non-conscious cognitive processing going on to figure out, this is a teacup. Right, it's got water in it right now. But there's all this kind of unconscious representational manipulation that isn't conscious that happens before you get the teacup experience, right? So is there anything like that that can go on in plants, right? Some kind of simple version of something equivalent to what animals do in their non-conscious processing. Representational manipulation. Do plants, for example, represent seasons? Do they represent invading parasites? Do they communicate with each other through their root systems? Right? Is any of this worth calling cognition? Right. So that would be. So I don't know if that's a good example. I mean, I think it maybe is a good example.
Well, it's a good example to the extent that I think that, especially when you're talking about radical and unthinkable ideas, and there's just something inherent about that, especially when you tie it to this concept of the Overton window, that anything that lies outside of it, and probably why I've called it the Overton wasteland, there's a negative connotation there. There's an assumption that the thing to be discussed is negative in nature, and that you can only maybe come to negative conclusions with it. And so it's only when you bring in, when you start to pass those definitions out a bit more, when you instead of just using words like radical and unthinkable, you start to use ridiculous or pointless, and that it sort of opens the door a bit to things like, is it called, because you put it in the email thing, is it panpsychism?
Panpsychism is another example from
okay.
philosophy of psychology. This is different from plant cognition.
Okay.
Yeah, in a way, it's more radical, but it's also, among philosophers, I think, maybe more accepted than plant cognition. Maybe.
Right, okay.
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is ubiquitous in the universe. So, in some sense, everything has consciousness. Consciousness pervades the universe. Now, it doesn't mean that the teacup or the tree are conscious, because some panpsychists think that you don't get consciousness at the level of ordinary objects like that. What you get is some sort of micro level consciousness in individual constituent atoms. We have a very simple kind of atomic consciousness. And then you have consciousness in, say, humans and other complex animals, but maybe not between. And others have said that maybe the universe as a whole, you might even think of this as a kind of version of theism. Maybe the universe as a whole is a conscious system of which we and other things are parts. So those kinds of panpsychist views have been getting more attention recently in philosophy in the last 20 years or so. They've been starting to get attention. It's definitely not a majority view, but there are some very prominent scholars like David Chalmers and Philip Goff who take it quite seriously. And so people are now discussing it in a way that in the early 1990s, it was not being discussed seriously.
So that's interesting, because I use this as the most obvious example, because I mean it caused a lot of trouble for Sam Harris when he brought it out. But this idea of race and IQ, which I confess I am going to go into this myself. I'm intrigued by the topic, but it's clear why that discussion sits outside the Overton window, because inherent within this discussion about the connection between race and IQ, the inevitable outcome to that is there's going to be some sort of hierarchical outcome to it, that one race is going to be deemed, on the whole, more intelligent than another. So it's like, that's obvious. That's obvious why that's troublesome. But when something sits outside the philosophical Overton window, like panpsychism or plant cognition, why is that outside? Especially with philosophy, because philosophy is, I would assume that philosophy is more immune to criticism from this perspective than other disciplines are. And so I'm just wondering, for me in philosophy, sort of anything goes, but why is it that those two in particular are considered a bit sort of off the wall? And
yeah, philosophy is a nice discipline in that I think there is more freedom than in a lot of other disciplines to explore positions that people might find ridiculous. There's this question about the offensive elements of it, and we can maybe get into that, and no platforming objections against discussing offensive views. But if we're not talking about views that we don't add the dimension of offensiveness to it. We just think about things like panpsychism and plant cognition or various forms of radical skepticism, right? It seems like philosophers have more license to talk about it than, say, psychologists. There's something about philosophy that invites people to debate and consider really radical things. I think that's one of the features that draws me to philosophy in particular.
Do you think it's an evidence thing, that maybe this idea that at one time philosophy and science were maybe wrapped up and considered one and the same, whereas I know very little about all this, but I'm assuming during the Enlightenment there was maybe a distinction drawn between the two, and that philosophy was what sat on the fringes. It became to be what sits on the fringes of science.
Yeah, so I think there's some truth in this idea that philosophy used to be basically kind of general theory of whatever, and it could be physics, it could be psychology. I mean, what we would now call physics, what we would now call psychology, and all that, all kind of part of philosophy. And then around the time of the Enlightenment or the early modern period, some philosophy became natural philosophy, which we now think of as the natural sciences. And philosophers then, people we now think of as philosophers, mostly focused on what we now think of as philosophy and psychology and social sciences and political science and stuff like that. And chemistry and physics went their own way. And then maybe in the 19th century, the other disciplines started pairing off. So philosophy kind of gets the remainder of what doesn't get paired off into scientific disciplines. So that is one story about the history of philosophy that I think is kind of interesting. And maybe it does connect with this Overton window idea in the sense that philosophers are kind of left to contemplate the stuff for which there isn't really clear, straightforward scientific testing.
Right.
And when you're doing that, the standards of evidence and argument are a little confusing. And so, if you're within, say, a standard kind of version of a discipline, like, okay, here are the methods that we use, and here are the standards we use, and with these methods and these standards, these are the things that are possible. And those things aren't they don't even show up in the methods, and they clearly violate the standards. Philosophy doesn't have that kind of constraint to it. And I think actually scientists, when they get philosophical, sometimes leave those constraints behind. I don't think philosophy is only done by professional philosophers by any means.
So, you see, that raises the question then, and we'll sort of bring the offensive aspect back into the fold, because that's going to be my biggest problem in doing this podcast is running into that emotion, I guess, eliciting that emotion from people. Is who gets to decide what lies within the Overton window, and from both perspectives, like, who gets to decide who's the gatekeeper in philosophy that says panpsychism, that's what all the weirdos and the hippy dippy types are doing over there. That's not serious, scholarly philosophy. And also, who gets to decide what's offensive or not?
Yeah, I kind of think it's the audience, right? So if you say something that is offensive, then your audience pushes back and they don't want to hear it. They unsubscribe to your podcast or decide they don't want to read anything more by you, or they call you out in public and embarrass you, right? So I don't think that there shouldn't be a committee that decides, okay, here's where it is. It's kind of in terms of the audience reaction. And then for different audiences, there are different things will be inside or outside the window, and inside or outside the offensive part of the wasteland.
Yeah, but the thing is, you see, that you've got that subjective aspect where the audience will change. You know, some people will go, "This isn't for me. I'm out." Other people stumble across it and go, "I quite like this sort of conversation. I'm in." And so then,
Right.
you know, I'm sort of inadvertently maybe creating an echo chamber around me or whatever. Or no, not an echo chamber, because it's not. I'm not looking for people to agree with me, but I'm looking for an audience that's like me, that's just open to any sort of discussion. But outside of my audience, there is a general public attitude towards certain subjects, and that would differ country by country as well. Different cultures will have different opinions about what's acceptable or not. But I'm wondering what I know this is all speculative, but I'm just wondering what you think of the origins of it. Like, when does, for example, when we're talking in email, one of the examples that you gave was gay marriage. So once upon a time, gay marriage was that was considered an unthinkable, radical idea, and now it's like, who's bothered, sort of thing.
Right.
What are the mechanics of that process? How does that happen? Because it couldn't just, you know, it was always maybe an acceptable idea to the gay community, but to the public as a whole, it was an unthinkable or a radical idea. But that changed over time, and I'm just wondering what are the mechanisms behind that.
Yes, that is an interesting one, because I was born in 1968. You know, so I've seen over the course of my life really strong changes in attitudes toward gay, lesbian, queer people, including a shift in gay marriage in particular. Excuse me, I got a cough. And, you know, I was always kind of on the political left. When I was in college, I was in this kind of semi-hippie co-op. And I remember even there, right, when someone floated this is in the late 80s, someone floated the idea of gay marriage, and I had gay friends. I actually sometimes dressed in women's clothes myself, right? Someone floated the idea of gay marriage by me, and I was just like, well, of course not. Like, isn't marriage kind of a man-woman thing? I mean, it didn't even occur to me to endorse it, despite the fact that I was, you know, for my culture and my time, pretty far toward the audience you'd think would find it acceptable. And I really didn't become fully convinced of it until I later gave it some more serious thought in the 90s and early 2000s. So it was interesting to see that shift. And what was the source of the change?
You see, there's the right-wing journalist Andrew Breitbart, before he died, one of his famous sort of observations is that he said that politics was downstream from culture.
Yeah.
And I think I agree with that one. And so it seems to be that these ideas have to, it's all a grassroots. It's all grassroots effort, I guess, that starts the ball rolling. But then I don't quite understand how it makes its way out of that. Whether, you know, do these grassroots movements, organizations, do they have to be just so sort of forceful and vocal as to sort of impose these ideas on society, and then society conforms? Because, you know, for instance, the whole transsexual issue at the moment, this big one, this big idea, which I disagree with. I've already got a conversation lined up to have with somebody on this, but the idea that trans women are women. Now, I don't accept that. I don't accept that at a biological level. I don't accept it at a linguistic level with these different pronouns that are proposed. I've got a lot of issues with it. Now, I don't care about somebody being trans. My biggest thing in life is I want everybody to be happy. Anybody that can do whatever they can in their life without harming anybody else that makes them happy. I'm all for that. But I won't deny science, let's put it that way. And for me, this idea that trans women are women is, to me, it's a ridiculous idea. But it seems to be one that's being adopted at a policy level within certain governments and all, like with like Canada passing Bill C-16, which was sort of related to this. And I wonder whether, I think that the majority of people do not believe that, but they're being forced to. It's too dangerous. It's almost like what's outside the Overton window there is to deny science, and that's become a dangerous idea. And again, I don't quite know how that happens. I don't get the mechanisms of sociological, philosophical. And again, I know this is all speculative, we're spitballing here, but I just wondered if you had any.
Well, yeah, I think it happens a few different ways. And let's get to the trans issue in a minute. But first, with the gay marriage issue, I wonder to what extent it was personalities like Ellen.
Right.
Everyone, how can you not like Ellen? Right? And she was one of the first people who was super prominent in entertainment, who was 100% out. And she did it in a non-threatening, a safe way. And I think that, and people like her and movements like that, may have had a big effect on people's perception of gay people in general and their openness to gay marriage. In other cases, marching on the streets may have an effect, but I don't know if like the gay pride parades in particular. I mean, it's an empirical question that I haven't studied, so I don't know.
Right.
But if I had to guess, I would guess that probably Ellen and that kind of approach had more effect on that particular issue than the parades in the streets. But with something like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and civil rights, maybe the parading on the streets had at least as much of an effect. I don't know. So I suspect it happens in a bunch of different ways. And I think it also can happen from the top, right? One, if you have a prominent enough person saying something often enough, it can enter the window that way. One example of this might be Bernie Sanders on free college education in the United States, right? So many countries other than the United States offer free college education. I guess the UK has moved the other direction recently, but it was not really much discussed in the United States politically. It was kind of not on the radar until people like Bernie Sanders got it on the radar, partly, and they're prominent enough to put it on. So I suspect there's a bunch of different mechanisms. There can be this kind of bottom up, and there can be the kind of soft Ellen touch, and there can be the hard insisting touch, and then there can be the top down Bernie Sanders approach. There's probably lots of different ways that.
That actually reminds me of one of the things again that you mentioned that we were discussing in the email, is this idea that when people suggest something completely off the wall, then suggesting it's almost like a negotiation technique, I guess, where you go to buy a car, you're haggling over the car, the guy wants £1,000 for it, you want to pay $500. So a good starting point for you, if you want to bring it down to 500, is not by saying 500 because he's going to work you back up to 750. Is for you to say, right, I'll only give you 200 quid for it, which sounds ridiculous. And the guy's like, how dare you? But then bringing it back towards the 500 mark sounds a bit more sort of realistic and a bit more of a sober approach. And I'm wondering whether, you see, with something like with the trans issue, the trans women are women thing, for me, it's too far. But I'm wondering whether those people that are doing that, on the whole, are actually doing trans people a favour Do you know what I mean? Because it's trans women are literally women, and a lot of people are going to balk at that and be like, oh, hell no, that's ridiculous. But then as a result of this, what a lot of people consider a sort of radical suggestion, those same people might be willing to accept other aspects of trans culture. I think I've done a nice little analysis there that I've just off the top of my head.
So, right. So I think I'm probably more positive about the trans women idea than you are, although I haven't studied it carefully. I think that what a woman is, it sounds like a straightforward biological category, but once you look at the mechanisms of biology and gender and the complex role that biology plays, I think it might become a more complex question where it's not kind of like as straight a yes-no sorting as a lot of us in our kind of folk biological minds think of it. And if it's not a kind of straightforward, if there's not a straightforward biological answer in all cases, then that opens up at least some room for political and practical and moral negotiation about exactly what the boundaries are. I mean, in science in general, right? It's hard to have a completely value-free science. Where you draw the boundaries between things in gray cases is sometimes a decision that has moral and political consequences.
Yeah.
So if sex and gender are like that, right, then there's at least room for these kinds of moral, social, political considerations to enter into the discussion.
Right. Well, we'll not get into the weeds with that one now because.
So we don't. Yeah, but I'm not expert enough on that issue to get into the weeds. But I did want to register that that perspective on the issue. So. But
you see, for me, it's just that. The reason I'm going through all this is I'm not necessarily interested in coming to any particular conclusions or convincing anybody of any particular conclusion. The reason this is of interest to me, the conclusion that I am trying to convince people of is that anything is up for conversation. That there's nothing off the table. That regardless of it being offensive, that's fine. You can still discuss something no matter how offensive it is. That's the idea I'm trying to convince people of.
I'm not sure I'm on board with that either.
Well, perfect. I was hoping you weren't going to be. Because you see, the thing that comes out of that question is whether some people would argue that there is such thing as dangerous discourse, that even if I don't agree with the conclusions of the people I'm having these discussions with, that merely by giving people a platform, that there are going to be negative consequences merely as a result of having the conversation. And so, like I brought up a bit of a disagreement with you there, and I'll just throw that over to you and what you think of that.
Right. So Neil Levy is a philosopher who's talked a little bit about this, I think, in an interesting way. He talks about, he makes a case for no platforming on the grounds that we rely on institutions like universities and the press, and the stakes are higher, and we rely more on them. When you're talking about super prominent places like Oxford or the New York Times or whatever, right? We rely on them to make judgments about who is an expert and who is not, what views are worth listening to and what are not. Right? You can imagine a kind of extreme case where Oxford just lets anybody say anything and teach any class they want. Right? Then you can no longer rely on it to think, okay, this is real science and that's just nonsense. Right? We rely on our institutions to do a certain kind of meta epistemology, or maybe it's just straight level epistemology. Sorting out what's worth listening to, who is an expert, who's not, right? Because if you're not in the weeds in biology, right, you kind of need to say, okay, well, this is in the textbook, and this person is teaching at a prominent school, so I think, probably they deserve some credit. So So we need probably some sort of standards for allowing people the resources of these platforms that we've created as a society through our institutions.
Yeah, I mean the obvious issue that springs to mind straight away with that one is that academia is overwhelmingly a left-wing profession. I mean, especially we covered this in previous episodes, especially in the humanities. I think it's the Adam Smith Institute have done a study that showed that about 80 to 85% of people in the humanities identify as left-leaning. And then there was other research that was done by a guy called Yoel Imbar, again on the podcast previous episode, that showed that there's active discrimination against conservatives within academia, things like neglecting to invite conservatives to conferences, people saying that they wouldn't hire somebody if they knew they were a conservative, people saying that they wouldn't fund any research that they knew a conservative was involved in. And so that's inherently a problem when we say, it's up to the universities to decide who and what is worth discussing, because, for a lot of people on the left, anything even remotely conservative is considered sort of radical and unthinkable. And so people are deplatformed in that sense. So
Yes.
where's the middle ground with that? I don't think there is any, is there?
Well, I think there is. I mean, I agree with you that the academic institutions as they currently exist in the United States and the UK tend to have more people on the political left than on the political right. And there's probably a multi-causal explanation of that. And that does result, I think, sometimes in, I suspect, some prejudice in academia against people who are on the political right. So how do we deal with that? How do we manage that? It's not totally clear how to deal with that and how to manage that.
I don't think you can. Especially in the political climate at the moment. I think it's so the two sides have become so sort of polarized that any sort of meeting of the minds is just becoming less and less likely. But what I will say though is I'm not. You see, I identify as conservative, as right wing, but I'm not a fan of what some conservatives will argue that people have a right to a platform, things like Twitter, and because they're becoming like a public service, and that it's incumbent on the universities to invite people with different viewpoints in order to facilitate educational discourse. And I mean, I guess I know where they're coming from, but I also agree with a private company, private school, university. If they don't want someone on the campus, tough shit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But which is where I think people like me come into it, because I'm not reliant on anybody for a platform. I mean, there's every chance that I could end up getting booted off YouTube and SoundCloud and what have you. And fine, again, it's their platform. They can do what they want. I'm not bothered. But when we strip away though the idea of academia and an institution, and you've just got me, so I'm just some punk on the internet who's, I've not got any sort of formal education. A lot of these conversations I'm having with people are vastly superior to me in intellect and experience, and so I'm genuinely here to learn from people as well as to play devil's advocate and sometimes argue my own perspective. But coming back to this idea of dangerous discourse, when we strip away the idea of, say, like you say, Oxford University, if they get somebody who's a radical or offensive thinker or whatever, they do run the risk of destroying their own reputation of being associated with that person. I don't run that risk. I can get booted off YouTube. It doesn't matter to me. I've been fired from loads of jobs, and I always spring back. I'm not bothered about that. So if people find it offensive that I'm associated with these people, and I get fired, or I'm not bothered. Let's say that now.
Right.
But what I wouldn't want to do, but what I don't believe is going to be the case, is that just by mere virtue of sitting down with these people and having conversations with them, that there's something inherently dangerous about that. That just by having a conversation with a radical thinker, somebody who's got offensive ideas, that I'm endangering other people. And I don't believe that I am. But I wonder what you think about that.
I lean toward being more open and more engaging with more ideas than I'd say a lot of people who are on the left, or maybe who are on the right. But I'm not sure I'd go all the way toward a blanket view on which you can just say, have a calm discussion with a Nazi about whether it's a good or bad idea to kill all the Jewish people or something like that, right? Yeah, there is, even you'll have some followers, you've got a platform, right? If a Nazi says, well, look, I'm prominent, I'm an important thinker, and among my credits is I was on this great podcast, right? And so that's a kind of platforming thing. I think in a way, although this isn't Oxford University, it is a platform that gives people credit and gives people a voice and amplifies their voice. So giving credit and amplification to, say, a Nazi, just to take a extreme case that pretty much everyone's going to agree on, there are downsides to that. Now, there might also be upsides, right? So I'm just mentioning the downsides, and the downsides in this case probably outweigh the upsides, I would think.
Well, sorry, Eric. Be specific about the downsides. Are you worried that by allowing somebody a platform, they get access to the people, whatever amount of listeners there are for this podcast, they get access to that audience, and by I was going to say spouting. That's already showing prejudice. I'm not supposed to do that. But by sharing their ideas, that there's a risk of converting people to their ideas.
Well, here the Overton window maybe is useful again, right? So let's say, we'll stay with the easy example that doesn't have to be controversial, right? So say a Nazi who favors exterminating the Jews, right? So bring him on this podcast, have him give his voice. I don't think there are many people who are going to be convinced, oh yeah, we should exterminate the Jews, right? And maybe that will be one. But even if there's one and he goes and shoots up a synagogue, you've got a problem, right? There may be someone who shoots up a synagogue who wouldn't have, because you brought that guy into the program, right? So that's one possibility. The other possibility is, even if he doesn't convince a single person, right? The Overton window now, where you're talking about how you put something on you say some far end view that people reject, but maybe it shifts the window a little bit and people are like, more moderate things are okay, right? So they might think, well, of course you don't want to exterminate the Jews, right? But maybe it makes sense to have some restrictions on them, right? Maybe there was something, a little bit right about the Nazi portrayal of the Jews, even if I'm not an exterminationist, right? But, right? So it could open up a little bit more of the window in the anti-Semitic direction. So I think those are two kinds of consequences that you could have on your listeners from bringing an exterminationist Nazi onto the program, right? And likewise, then the other thing that I mentioned is now that person can go to the neo-Nazi website and say, hey, look, I'm prominent because look, I've been on this, maybe not just this podcast, but I've been on these 5 podcasts and I had, this happen, right? So they're like, oh, well, he's got, for a Nazi, he's got a pretty big presence, right? So it amplifies his ability to then be further heard. So I'm not saying that I suspect in the case of the Nazi, these downsides would outweigh the upsides, but I'm not saying it's a clear decision, even when they're, if you have someone like a pedophile who favors contact, right? I think those downsides are still present. I think there are also, as I'm sure you're keenly aware of, right, and I think are real, upsides to being open to everything and listening to everything. John Stuart Mill has a nice discussion. Have you read Mill's On Liberty?
I haven't, no. I've got it in my Kindle library, but I've never read it,
John Stuart Mill has a nice discussion of why we should allow freedom of speech even on views we find offensive. He offers several considerations, right? So I think these are positive considerations, right? He thinks, so among the considerations that Mill mentions is that people who have the mainstream view, let's just assume the mainstream view is correct. People who have the mainstream view will have it better and more securely once they've heard the best that the other side can offer and realize correctly that it isn't very good. Right. So they can better assess their own position. And once they've assessed that position and they're more solid in it, and they'll stay kind of closer to the truth than if you forbid a view, right, then no one hears the arguments and counter arguments. And then maybe one of their friends comes in and says, hey, how about this view? And they're like, yeah, that's forbidden. I've never heard that before. I don't know how to argue against it. Maybe you're right. Whereas if it hadn't been forbidden, you wouldn't be opening up to that. So Mill thinks actually really, even if you set aside the possibility that people with unusual views are correct, even if you just assume that the mainstream view is correct, having open discourse about the incorrect views is actually good for strengthening and solidifying and giving better epistemic grounding to the mainstream view. Right. So those are totally upsides. I mean, if you could take a Nazi out of your program and just like at the end of the program, people are like, that's the best the Nazis could do, right? That's ridiculous, right? Then they'll be even more secure than if they wonder about this, suppressed view that maybe it has something to it, right? So there are downside. I think there are downsides and upsides to this when we talk about offensive views, and they need to be weighed against each other. And it's not clear that the weighing is always going to come out the same direction.
Yeah, you see, for me, with what going to go into certain conversations assuming that it's a bad idea, and I believe like sunlight's the best disinfectant. It's kind of what you touched upon there. I do think it would be incumbent on me. It would be irresponsible of an interviewer to go into a discussion like that not well prepared, because especially in those discussions, it's very much incumbent on the interviewer to play devil's advocate to a sort of masterful level. I think a good example of that was the discussion I had with Tom O'Carroll on this pro-contact idea. That guy is extremely well educated. Now, it was I have to say, Eric, on the whole, with the harm caused by it and all the scientific, the empirical evidence against it, was very much in my favour, which sort of goes without saying. But some of the philosophical ideas that he threw at me were tricky ones to get around, and I wasn't prepared for those. But you see, even in that instance, I felt it was good because I think, one of these ideas, I don't know if you've got this over in America. There's this thing called paedophile hunters in the UK, and it's basically it's like these various little vigilante groups where they'll go online and they'll pose as a kid, and they'll arrange for this grown adult to meet up with a kid, and then it's like it's usually like three big burly guys with a camera and stuff, and they go meet the guy and confront him and say, "Who are you here to meet?" And more often than not, I find those, I've got no sympathy for the guys, obviously, but I find that those encounters very uncomfortable because the vast majority of them, you can tell that these are guys that they're not all there. Do you know what I mean? It's very clear just from the way they talk, the way they hold themselves, everything, the grammar they use, they're very low IQ people, and as a result of these videos that go out there, I think a lot of people assume that these guys that are after little kids, they're all these sort of scruffy, bearded old men that are a bit, they're not smart, they're a bit dumb, the lower working class sort of lumpen proletariat types, and for my audience, meeting somebody like Tom, who was, middle class, university educated, super smart, high IQ, very articulate, that was a big wake up call for a lot of people. It was like, wow. So it brought it home that it's not just the weird guy that lives on his own with a beard and the bald head.
Definitely not.
It could be anybody. And then when it's somebody as smart and articulate as Tom, the danger becomes even more sort of visceral and apparent. And so even though, even in that instance where I didn't do so well as an interviewer, there was something about that experience that that was positive. Even it was negative for me as an interviewer.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Do you know what I mean? I think it could be the same for if I interviewed somebody that was far right associated with the Nazis, that it's sort of easy pickings to get a young lad who's a student who's become radicalized and maybe got beat up by a black lad, and it all stems from that stupid little incident, and is underlying philosophy or worldview that all this relies on is very shaky and uneducated, and the empirical groundings of it can be picked apart easily, especially by someone like me that's a generalist. It's one thing to get owned by a specialist, but when someone like me can come along who's maybe studied it for a couple of hours versus your apparent years of doing so, and I can make you look like an idiot, it's not a good look, but it's easy pickings. Whereas if somebody comes on that's, they've really thought this through, they've read the literature, maybe they've not just been reading, Hitler's like Mein Kampf and Protocols of the Elders of Zion and all that crap, but they've maybe studied things like anthropology and different cultural histories, and they've got a very well-rounded argument that, as well as risking convincing people, it could also show people the dangers of, oh shit, like this stuff, it's not just some skinhead idiot that's into this. There's some smart people out there that are backing this up. And so on the flip side of radicalizing someone who's an audience member of mine, it could radicalize someone else the opposite way, like, I'm completely anti-racism. Of course, I'd never vote for that sort of party, but I've never really got involved in politics before. Whereas you see this person come on who's smart and articulate and on the ball, and that could radicalize someone the other way and say, "Oh shit, we really need to get out there and be doing something against this people because it's not just a bunch of thugs. This is a genuine threat." So.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective on it. I mean, I think I'm agreeing that that's an advantage, right? So you invite someone onto the podcast, right? And I like the idea that you are very prepared, right? You don't want to invite a Nazi or a pro-contact pedophile onto the podcast and have them throw stuff at you, and you're like, "Wow, I never heard of that research before. Wow, it's really not so bad." Well, I'm sure you're wrong, but I don't know why. Right? Then they win the argument, and it's a disaster, right? But so you're well prepared. But also, it is true, right? And this is one of the things that I teach this giant lower division class called Evil. Really fascinating class to teach. And one of the main themes in that class is that evil is done by ordinary people who aren't monsters, who aren't thinking, "Yes, I'm doing evil." Right? I call that the Darth Vader conception. I'm on the dark side. Right? No, right? It's more like Hannah Arendt's famous portrayal of Eichmann, the notorious Nazi, right? As kind of just an ordinary bureaucrat who didn't think things through very well and just kind of like signing the train tables and sending Jews to their death. And it's like, "Hey, I love my job. Here's what my job is," right? "Oh, I get to hang out with the Nazi bureaucrats. They're so important. That's awesome." Right? That's evil. That's the face of evil a lot. Right? And right, there's this kind of easy cartooning of evil people as like Darth Vader, or you're the stereotype of the pedophile. And countering that is really important to being prepared for dealing with it, and recognizing it, and also recognizing the potentiality for it in yourself. So absolutely, I think that's an upside to having articulate people speaking on the other side, right? And also this connects back also with the mill, right? What really makes the mainstream position more solid is when you have, and you have, and there's good reasons to believe you have, the best version of the opposing view out there to consider, right? You're like, here's the best version, right? Now I'm looking at the best version, and I still have solid arguments. It still doesn't stand up, and this is as good as it gets. So now I'm more comfortable and confident and know how to respond. So yeah, there are absolutely these upsides to having people on, and they just need to be, the downsides need to be considered also and weighed against each other. I think probably on an ad hoc basis. There's probably not one blanket principle.
Let's say just a couple more things to consider on this. Let's say I brought somebody onto the podcast and they had some sort of controversial opinion. We went back and forth on it, and then based on the evidence that we both put forth and the strength of the arguments and a little bit of rhetoric and what have you, that it seemed like a bit of a draw. Like, he hasn't owned me, I haven't owned him, she hasn't owned me, I haven't owned her, whatever. We've both done all right. And then you could say that might, especially if it's a particularly troublesome opinion that this person's come on to espouse, that I haven't done my job as an interviewer. Now, obviously, aside from that, there is an issue about like it or not, maybe this other person's argument at an empirical level is stronger than mine. The evidence backs them up. But that idea aside, if I've done an insufficient job as an interviewer, and then we come back to this problem of, because you didn't do a very good job as an interviewer there, you do risk, you've risked the very thing that we've been talking about, which is you've shifted the Overton window possibly in an individual's mind, and in favour of this other person. And that's a perfect example of why you shouldn't be having these sorts of discussions. But I wonder, firstly, how much of that is a sort of paternalistic attitude or perspective, or it's condescending of the audience to say, you shouldn't be having these conversations because what about your audience? And my argument against that would be that a lot of my audience are way smarter than me. I mean, I get plenty of emails from people that have done some sort of analysis on an episode, and I'm reading it like, wow, thanks for this. This is brilliant. And I wish I'd known this sort of stuff in the first place. And yeah, like I say, that's just, it's a feeling I get, is this idea that you have to sort of baby your audience, and I trust my audience to make their own decision, even if I do a bad job. They can sit there on their own. They don't need me to argue on their behalf. That they can do it for themselves.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that, right? I agree that some of the kind of reasoning that I was saying is a little on the paternalistic side, and I think paternalism, in the sense that you mean it, in the kind of ethical, philosophical sense of kind of deciding for someone else who's an adult what's in their best interest, rather than kind of, so constraining their decisions or what they're exposed to because you don't trust them to reach the right decisions or reach the right judgments. I think that paternalism is ethically problematic. So that's another thing weighing on the side of openness, right? But there's also sometimes, right? So let's just imagine the one guy who shoots up the synagogue. You get the Nazi on.
Well, this is the next question, right? So yeah, let's go down this.
And
road.
There's one person who's kind of on the edge, right? And it turns out that this episode is the thing. They're like, you know what? The Jews, yeah, that's it. I'm going, right? And this is the thing that turns them, right? So there is that, right? So paternalism is definitely a con in this kind of weighing that I'm thinking about, right? But also that potentiality is a con, and that's a huge potential outcome.
Yes, well, that one, I have to admit, Eric, that one does, it gives me pause. That one, it makes me think for a moment. But this argument against it is partly me just playing devil's advocate and sort of pushing it to the max, the devil's advocate stance. But I am on board with it. I've not decided to what extent I'm on board with this idea yet. And that is that if some sicko out there is going to listen to a podcast and go and shoot a synagogue up as a result of it. And even if he goes out and says, he gets arrested and he says, I did that because I listened to that Renegade 8 podcast, and tries to blame it on me, my...
Not your fault.
And I know it's not my fault. That is that is an independent individual making their own choices, and especially when you weigh it against the rest of the audience. If the episode gets sometimes we get up around 50,000 plays, 49,999 people were I'm good, and this one idiot goes out and does something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know that even if they want to point the finger at me, I don't know that I'm willing to accept the blame for it.
It's not your fault. It's that person's fault. But it is a potential consequence. There are people out there who do terrible things, who are on the edge, right? And it's their fault for doing those terrible things, typically, right? But if you do the things that make the difference between whether they go one way or another, then you are contributing to, in your small way, to the causal process that results in the bad thing happening. Let me just give you another totally different kind of example. Suicide. Well, I'm sure you know a lot about suicide.
Mm-hmm.
You've thought about these kinds of things, right? So there's my understanding, you probably know better than I do, but my understanding is that small things, small barriers can make a big difference to other people commit suicide, right? So
yes.
A lot of people used to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and they put up higher fences, and it's a lot less common. And you think, look, if someone's going to commit suicide, right? They're going to do it or they're not. They already decided. But like in that moment when they're on the bridge thinking about whether to go or not, like the slightly higher fence, this is how I'm imagining the research suggests, right? But you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the way I picture it is, in that moment when you're like, they're going back and forth in their mind, they're on the bridge, they're on the brink of committing suicide, right? That somewhat higher, substantially higher fence. I mean, they still could climb over it and commit suicide, right? But that barrier has, I think, a substantial effect in reducing it.
It does.
Right.
My understanding of the literature is that removal of means is the most effective way of bringing down the suicide rate. Yes.
Yes. And I don't think it has to be radical removal. It can just be a higher fence on the Golden Gate Bridge, or it can be no gun in the house, but still you could kill yourself with a knife or pills, right? By taking away one of the means, right? So in those kinds of cases, I mean, it's a little paternalistic, right? You could say, well, look, the Golden Gate Bridge, you're all adults, right? You can jump or not, right? But you're a little paternalistic, in putting up that fence. So it's a little bit, and if the person jumps, it's not the engineer's fault for not having put up a fence. But there's a sense in which if you don't put up the fence and you leave the means there, you are part of the causal process that contributed to the bad outcome. Right. So I'm thinking this, you might think of it similarly with this person who's maybe on the cusp of shooting up a synagogue. Right. Part of the means is listening to Nazis on podcasts and on the internet. Right. And by not giving them a platform, you're taking away one of those means. Right.
So, well, this is a perfect segue into, I guess this will sort of bring it to a close now, but this is the idea that, let's say I think, and based on that last argument, which is a good argument, I think there's some analogy issues there, but
yeah,
let's go with it and say, okay, those sorts of people, those that are considered unthinkable on the Overton Window scale, I'm not going to go there. I'm only going to go as far as radical. I'm not going to go to unthinkable.
Yeah.
I would still argue that there's damage done by ignoring these ideas, that let these ideas fester and grow because say with a Nazi idea, if nobody talked about it, and even for the people that are involved in it, that have got that opinion, that believe, that Adolf Hitler was great and that we should, bring back the Third Reich or whatever, that really believe in this stuff, giving those people access to a platform and discussing these things with those people, it does two things. For one, it's not just the audience that you're trying to convince or reconvince the idea that Nazism is bad. But there's a chance that by having discourse with the people that are actively involved in those sorts of movements and have those ideas, that you can convince them otherwise. And I know that there's various psychological issues. I know that I can't remember one of them where if there's a tendency with people where you confront people with evidence that's contrary to their view, they become more steadfast in the views.
Belief polarization, yeah. Sometimes is what happens, yeah.
Yeah, so that is an issue, but I think there's potential there for convincing somebody that has these dodgy ideas that maybe they're wrong. That at the end of the day, like you were saying about, these evil people, at the end of the day, they're human beings, and to an extent, at least, they're rational human beings, or at least you can tap into that rationality. And so I think there's the chance of educating and changing the minds of those people directly, from a one-on-one perspective. And also, there's the chance that when I sit down and have a conversation with a right-winger, a far right-winger, should I say,
right,
I'm getting access to their audience as well. So there's a chance that it's not just my audience that are going to reaffirm the ideas against it, but that their audience might be convinced that they're talking shit as well. And then the second thing I think is, particularly when these people don't get a platform to share their ideas or to argue their ideas, there's a pressure cooker effect in that it makes those people hate certain individuals all the more, because because a Nazi can't go on a podcast and have an interview. It's because, I don't know, it's the Jews that control YouTube and they're shutting me down, and so it makes them hate all the more. And it makes them feel legitimately oppressed. I can't express my ideas. What the hell's going on? And by virtue of avoiding these conversations with these people, thinking you're doing the right thing and avoiding giving this person a platform, you're also inadvertently making things worse. And then, I guess, to an extent, that the argument that you were just making with suicide is, by being one of those people that is involved in the oppression of those opinions, you're actively then part of that process, which is making things worse at their end.
Yeah, I think both those points, I can feel the pull of both of those points. I think it could cut either way. But yeah, on changing people's opinions, having conversations with people you disagree with, sometimes it results in belief polarization where people just entrench more. But other times people move. You don't usually change someone's view radically in a single conversation, right? But that doesn't mean it doesn't change, right? If you have a conversation with someone you like, someone you respect, maybe, or at least they earn your respect during the conversation, then sometimes you shift a little, right? You might not be totally convinced, but your level of certainty is not what it was, right? And with the lesser certainty, you might not be as willing to take radical action. So it could have those kinds of positive effects. I could certainly imagine that, although I can also imagine the reverse. That's an empirical question.
Yeah, I've got to say, from not really an empirical standpoint, it's still philosophical, but a hypothetical standpoint anyway, is that when you argue the two against each other, I guess it still sort of comes out in favour of the argument you put forward when you say, by having this conversation, somebody might be radicalised and go out and shoot up a synagogue. And then on my side of the argument, I'm saying, I do have these conversations with people, and you might convince one person on the other side to abandon that lifestyle. I'm not sure that encouraging someone to abandon the lifestyle it doesn't weigh up against.
It's not quite as much of a positive impact as
But
shooting up a synagogue is a negative impact, unless that person was about to shoot up a synagogue.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think I set up a bit of a false dichotomy there. But
yeah, right.
Yeah. So, in closing, Eric, what would you? For me, I'm still overall convinced that anything goes, and I've got some interviews lined up with people that I know are going to be troublesome conversations. All people I disagree with, and all people I feel confident in going up against. But what would, if this was you in my shoes, what would you? What would be you be using as the yardstick to decide whether or not? Because again, at the end of the day, these are all hypothetical philosophical ideas. This abstract imaginary synagogue shooter and this abstract imaginary neo-Nazi kid who just the right argument and he's going to abandon the lifestyle. At the end of the day, it's just me in my living room deciding which conversations to have and whether or not to have them. And what do you think is the yardstick by which to judge whether or not each conversation's a good idea?
Yeah, because I don't think there's a single yardstick. I guess the way I'm thinking about it now, with the help of our conversation, is that it has to be an ad hoc decision, involve weighing a number of pros and cons against each other. I like the various pros and cons that we've come up with over the course of this conversation. I suspect I'll think of a few more later. Yeah. but I think we covered some pretty good bases, right?
Yeah.
And I don't see a formula for it, or a single one decisive consideration, as opposed to probably weighing thinking about all these factors, being aware of them, being super prepared, as we were discussing.
Yep.
We don't let down your side, the side of right and reason, right? You don't want to, you got to be super prepared. Yeah. So I don't, other than that's blanket advice, being super prepared. But as far as under what conditions would you invite someone with a very offensive kind of view? No one formula answer for that. I do, at least in my view. One thing I'm tempted to say, though, is that even though I think I probably would not invite all of the people that you're probably planning to invite, I don't think I would invite a Nazi, for example. It's probably good that there's someone out there doing what you're doing, right? So I think, well, it seems like a bad decision to give a Nazi a platform. But, imagine a society in which no one makes that bad decision. I'm not sure that's the society I would want, right? So at kind of a meta level, even though I might disagree with your decisions, I'm kind of glad there's someone out there making those bad decisions. I mean, not saying that any one of your decisions are bad, or, I haven't evaluated, I don't know who you're inviting, but let's just imagine, this is now the hypothetical Danny, right? Inviting the Nazi. Yeah, so I guess I kind of left with a meta level thing that's kind of glad you're doing it, and a base level thing that kind of thinks it's a bad decision.
You know what?
Or that hypothetical decision would be a bad one.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to be the guy that this maybe falls upon at some point. I mean, obviously it's incumbent on the podcast reaching a certain level of popularity. It's been a very sort of niche podcast at the moment that seems to have been favoured by academics and professionals. That it didn't start off like that. It'd be interesting to see where it goes. But I'm happy to be the guy that sparks that discussion, even if everybody thinks I'm in the wrong, even if it means getting banned off YouTube and SoundCloud and deplatform myself. Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile experiment, and it's one I'm willing to sort of put my head above the parapet and have a crack at. So
I'm wondering if I'll come to regret what I just said, the positive thing you just said. And I'm feeling a little bit of nervousness about that, just in terms of,
well,
would I really want to stand behind that? I like you. And I like what you're doing, and I like the boldness of it.
Yeah. The thing is, Eric, as well,
oh man, this might be a really bad idea. It might have some really bad consequences. So I feel torn myself.
Do you think there's anything to be said for intention? when it comes to something like this. I mean, I know at the, I know at the end of the day, if something terrible happened as a result of it, which again I'd argue that how much of the blame can be accepted with something like that is negligible in my opinion. But you see, the reason I'm not doing this to offend anybody on purpose. I don't so much care if I do, but that's only because the people that I might be offending, it's a sort of abstract audience, and you can never please anybody. I mean, I've already offended plenty of people with the old format of the podcast, and that was completely unintentional. My intention for doing this podcast is it's a genuine individual curiosity especially in human psychology. So if I was to invite a Nazi onto the podcast, it wouldn't be so much that let's take it all point by point, empirical evidence why you're right and I'm wrong. I'm interested in the individual psychology of these people, in the subjective experience of what it's like to be that sort of person and how you came to think like that and where the anger comes from that fuels it. And so, because it's genuine curiosity, and not just it's not just a way to piss people off. It's not just a way to try and get loads of listeners. Like, oh, this will be controversial. Let's go do this.
Yeah.
I couldn't, if I'm being honest, I couldn't care less how big the audience gets. I'm not really in it for that. I just like having those conversations, and so I'm wondering if that's enough of a reason, or maybe an excuse, some people might say, to go ahead and have these conversations. At the end of the day, it's not. I'm not trying to get anything out of it or trying to be controversial by having controversial conversations. I'm doing it because I enjoy it and because I'm genuinely curious about the various actors involved. Or is that just...
Yeah. I think that intention is better. Right. I like that. I mean, I don't think that is fully exculpatory.
No, definitely not.
It's not fully exculpatory, but it's definitely better than doing it for other kinds of reasons, I think. Yeah. And it probably will color your podcast in a good way in several respects, right? Makes it more clinical and more critical and attracts a different type of listener who might have similar kinds of intentions and interests. So I like that. I think part of the reason that I like you and I like this project, the part of me that likes it is that intention.
Right. Well, I think, Eric, we've got plenty for me to go away and think about there, and I think we've done a pretty damn good job there of covering that tight. It's only a tiny topic, and like you say, there's not much literature behind it. But yeah, I think we've done a good job of passing it out, and I've got to say, it feels good to be back in the saddle. That was I enjoyed that. It's the first interview I've done for maybe 7 months now, and you've just reminded me why I enjoy doing this so much. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It was a fun, interesting conversation that I think I'll be reflecting on for quite a while still.
Right. So before you go, just want to give yourself a plug, any website, social media, books, things like that.
Right. Well, my blog is called The Splintered Mind. I post there on philosophy and psychology and science fiction. I've got my most recent book you mentioned is A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures. I'm also going to have a new anthology is going to come forward. There it is.
That's the one.
Yep. And a new anthology coming forward with Bloomsbury Press called Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories. Will be coming out hopefully later this year with Helen de Cruz and Johan de Smet, where we use science fiction stories as a means of exploring philosophical issues. I'm pretty excited about getting that out there.
Right, okay. Well, as always, I will include links in the show notes, folks, to Eric's blog and his books. In the meantime, Eric, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Talk later. Bye.